start decks for Overdress were released back in May of 2021 and were followed by set 1 merely a week later. Since then, we have received quite a few more sets. And with the Overdress anime having aired its final episode and the DivineZ era looming over the horizon, we thought it would be appropriate to look back at all the units we have received. Doing every nation in one video would make for quite a lengthy video, so we're going to break it up into the 6 main nations and then do all the extras in one. So in today's episode, we're going to talk about Shaman King. Similarly to Record Ragnarok, this collab set is inspired by an anime. But I'm going to be honest with you, the only thing I really know about this deck and like this collab set overall is the Overtrigger, because it is crazy. So just know that we're learning these decks together. So one thing to mention before we go into this, all these spirits in this set don't have a critical. So if you see a crit gaining effect on any of them, it's not as good as you may think, because you may think, oh well, it does 2 damage, and technically it only does 1 because they all start at crit 0, so they have to gain the ability to do a damage. Let's start with the protagonist of this series, Yo Asakura, who was a child deck for this collab, as well as receiving a form in the set. The child deck form allows you to put a rear guard with Amidamaru, so you can draw a card and then your front row gains +5 on turn of turn. This ability is called Oversoul, and pretty much every unit except for I think 1 has the Oversoul ability. These abilities usually involve putting their corresponding spirits into soul to gain some sort of effect. However, his second ability allows him to gain a crit if you have 4 more damage, as long as you counterblast 1. So it's just a crit. Vanguard doesn't have anything too interesting here. So let's just move on to the main set form. This Yo Asakura can only be written on a grade 3 Yo, so again, he can't be in the right deck. He has to be in your main deck. When it's placed, it automatically gains 10k in a crit. So that's pretty good. And then for his Oversoul, similarly to the child deck Yo, you have to put a rearguard with Amidamaru into Soul to give your front row +10k, and then when Yo battles, he attacks the entire column. So he'll attack the front row unit and the back row unit in whatever column he picks. Definitely a lot better than the child deck Yo, but we do have to look at his spirit, Amidamaru, to really grasp. There's only 1 normal unit, Amidamaru. It gains +5k if your Vanguard is Yo, and if your Vanguard activated their Oversoul ability, he gains a crit, which again, I have to remind you, doesn't put him to 2, it just puts him to 1. And you might be asking, well, how do you keep using Oversoul if there's only 4 copies of Amidamaru? You know, you could damage them, you could have to discard them, right? The game could go a little awry if you only have the 4 copies, and that's where the triggers from the set come in. The set brings us a heal, crit, and a draw trigger with the name Amidamaru, so you can use them to activate Oversoul, and then that way you get to keep your normal unit Amidamaru to use on board. This is a pretty tame start. Honestly, it's nothing too crazy here, but let's move on to the next member of Team Funbari Hot Springs, which is the name of Yo's team, I think. It's referenced on one of the cards, so that's the only reason I know. And the next member is Wooden Sword Ryu and his spirit Tokagero. Ryu has 2 forms, similarly to Yo. One form is only able to be written on a grade 3 Ryu, so essentially you're forced into one of the forms for your right deck, but let's talk about that form. When it's placed on Van, you can search your deck for a In Search of Happy Place from deck and add it to your hand. And then his Oversoul ability requires you counterblast 1 and put a rear guard with Tokagero into Soul to give all of your units +5k for each copy of In Search of Happy Place in Order, Zone, and Soul. Before we move on to his second form, let's look at the order that he keeps referencing, which is In Search of Happy Place, a grade 1 set order with 2 effects. The first is a continuous effect that gives your Ryu's buddies on rearguard circle a resist-like effect. The second is an auto that says when another copy of it is played, you may move it into Soul and give your Ryu a crit. And now let's look at the card Ryu's Buddy before we move on, because obviously it was referenced here. You're allowed to play 9 copies of it in the deck. It also gains intercept when your Ryu or other Ryu's buddies are attacked. And now let's move on to his second form. In this form, he will get you a Tokagero and In Search of Happy Place from Soul back to hand when he's placed. So you have a guaranteed Oversoul and a crit. The Oversoul ability again asks you to put a Tokagero into Soul, to then draw a card and call a card from hand and give all of your units +10k. Now let's look at Ryu's spirit, Tokagero. There are 2 normal units for this spirit. The first gains +2k during your turn and gives all Ryu in the same column as his +5k. The second can counterblast 1 to gain the ability to attack your opponent's back row units from the back row. It also has an ability that requires you have In Search of Happy Place to give your Ryu on Vanguard +5k, and then it becomes treated as Ryu's buddies, so you technically get to intercept with it if it's in the front row. Side note here is that the Ryu referenced in this effect is the right line Ryu, not the second form, so you can't give the second form the +5k. You can only get the ability to treat it as Ryu's buddy. Then similarly to Yo's Spirit, Tokugero has some trigger forms. In his case, we get a heal, a draw, and a front. So they're not always the same. It's not always going to be heal crit front or heal crit draw. Sometimes you'll see something like this. I believe even one of them has heal, crit, and draw. But with that, let's move on to the final member of Team Fumbari Hot Springs, Faust and his Spirit, Eliza. Faust's Oversoul requires you to put a rearguard with Eliza into Soul to countercharge 1 and call a normal unit Eliza from drop to rearguard. His second ability requires you counterblast 1 and retire 3 Skeleton Army tokens, and then you can call a Calcium Giant from hand or drop to rearguard. Let's look at both the Skeleton Army tokens and the Calcium Giant card before we move on to his second form. The Skeleton Army tokens are grade 0 5k units with boosts that are just kind of there to pay costs. They're more of just like sacrificial tokens. Calcium Giant is a grade 3 that can't be normal called. It gains plus 5k for each Necromancy in your order zone and retires itself at the end of turn. Now, let's look at the Necromancy order because obviously Calcium Giant referenced it. It's a grade 1 that has 2 abilities. The first is an auto that activates when it's put into order zone. It lets you look at top 2, get a card with Eliza, add it to hand, and then you discard the rest. The second is an act that lets you bind 3 cards from drop to call a Skeleton Army tokens equal to the number of Necromancy in your order zone. So at first this is going to be pretty slow, you'll only be getting 1. But once you get the deck rolling, you should be able to get at least 3. Then we have Faust's second form, which is similar to the others, can only be written on a grade 3 Faust, so it can't be in your right deck. This Faust Soul Blast 2 to call an Eliza from drop and gains plus 15k. Its Oversoul again needs you to put a rearguard with Eliza in its soul to give Faust plus 10k for each card with Eliza in its soul. So some big power if you just keep using your Oversoul. Now let's look at the 2 Eliza normal units. The first just gains plus 5k when it boosts a unit with Faust in its name. The second Eliza gains plus 10k in a crit if your Faust used its Oversoul that turn. It can also retire 3 Shadow Army tokens to restand at the end of the battle, so you have some multi-attack here. But remember, even though it gains a crit, it's not doing 2 damage, it's just doing the 1. Eliza also has 3 trigger units, a heal, a front, and a draw, so we got some, again, extra choices to activate Oversoul, and also to fill the soul to maybe get some extra power with one of Faust's abilities. And now let's move on to the another one of the teams, Team The Ren, starting with their leader, Towel Ren. Similarly to the other 3 we've just talked about, he has 2 forms. The first has Oversoul, just like the others. You counterblast 1 and put a rearguard with Basson into Soul. Then you retire all of your opponent's front row rearguards. Towel Ren then gains plus 10k, and if you retire 1 or less units, then your opponent has to discard a card. His second ability lets you search for a grade 3 rearguard card with Towel Ren when his attack hits. And then let's look at his second form, just like the others, again, has to be written on a grade 3 with Towel Ren, so it can't be in your right deck. When placed, it searches your deck for a grade 3 rearguard card with Towel Ren and add it to your hand. His Oversoul now just requires you to absorb the Basson rearguard to choose 3 of your opponent's rearguards and retire them. He also then gains plus 10k for every 5 cards in drop. Now, let's talk about Ren's Spirit, Basson. Basson only has 1 normal unit form, which will come back from drop when your grade 3 rearguard Vanguard with Tau Ren is placed if you don't already have a Basson, so similar to Maple from Keto Sanctuary. Before we talk about the triggers, we need to talk about one more spirit, that being Kokuto. A grade 1 that gives the Tau Ren or Basson it boosts plus 10k if your opponent has no front row rearguards, so you get some extra power. It is also another spirit, so I just thought I should mention it here. And then let's look at Basson's trigger forms. We've got a heal, a draw, and a crit, so it's nice to at least get the crit. The next member of the Ren is Horo Horo, and his spirit, Koro Ro. I am gonna struggle to say these names already, I'm gonna get confused. Similarly to all the others, he has 2 forms and can Oversoul. During your turn, you can play 2 orders, and if you play 2, he gains a drive. Then for his Oversoul, you have to put a rearguard with Kororo into Soul, and then he gets plus 5k, and then you choose a Horo Horo order from drop and put it into hand. Before we move on to the second form, let's look at the Horo Horo orders so that we know more or less what he kind of wants to do. There are 3 of them, all being grade 3. The first is Emis Noki Pekander, butchering the name. But for a CB, it lets you draw a card and give your Vanguard Horo Horo plus 10k. Pretty vanilla, pretty tame. But yeah, I mean, if you can play multiples with Horo Horo's first effect, it's not as awful. The next one is Mososo Krupe, which for a Soul Blast lets you draw a card and stun one of your opponent's front row rearguards. Don't think you're going to be playing this one, but it is an option. And then the last order is Kao Kao Prinwenpe, that forces an opponent's rearguard in the back row forward, and if it cannot come forward, you retire it. So if there's a rearguard in front of it, you would just retire the unit. Then you can get a Horo Horo order with a different name from your drop back to your hand. If you do get a card though, you have to bind this order. So you essentially guarantees you get to play 2 orders in a turn by getting one of them back. But now let's look at the second form of Horo Horo that, just like all the others, can only be written on a grade 3 version of itself, so it can't be in the right deck. He maintains his ability to play 2 orders, but now you can get a normal order from drop, which is pretty good. His Oversoul again asks you to put a rearguard with Kororo into Soul, and then you retire all of your opponent's grade 1 or less rearguards. He then gains plus 10k in a crit. But now let's look at his spirit, Kororo, who only has one normal unit form. It can combine itself from drop if your Vanguard is Hororo and hasn't oversold to call a trigger Kororo to rearguard. So it makes it so that every time you oversoul, you don't have to keep calling a trigger, which is pretty good. But it doesn't really do anything on rearguard, unfortunately. But as far as triggers go, Kororo got a heal, a front, and a crit form, so you don't have to play draws in this deck, which is actually pretty nice, because a lot of the spirits have draws. And draws are nice, but you can't even play the effect draws. These are just vanilla draws. But let's move on to the last member of this team, Joko. Joko and the remainder of this list will only have one form, so we're done with the 2 form ones. But Joko has a spirit named Mick, who is a jaguar, which is pretty cool. I love like lions and stuff, so I mean, my name's Leo, so you kind of get it. Joko can oversoul by absorbing a make on rearguard to give your opponent's Vanguard minus 5k, and they're not allowed to intercept. Then his second ability allows you to restand Joko for a soul blast or for a counterblast 2 if you used oversoul that turn, but he does lose 2 drives, so you don't get any drive checks. With no second form to talk about, we just have to move on to his spirit, Mike. Mike has 2 normal units. The first gains plus 2k when it boosts, but if it boosts Joko, it gains plus 5k. This also then forces your opponent to reveal 3 cards from their hand, so you get some knowledge. The second Mike soul charges 1 when it's used to pay for oversoul, and then it gives your Vanguard plus 5k. So a nice option here of being able to use one of the Mikes to oversoul while keeping the other one as a really good booster. Mike also has a heal, crit, and draw form, although you could get away with playing maybe a little bit less of these since there are 2 normal unit Mike. But now we move on to the last 4 units. First up we have Jean. God, I really should just learn how to say these names. Who can counterblast 1 to search for a Jean order and add it to hand. Then for her oversoul, she requires you counterblast 1 and put a rearguard with Shamash into soul. This gives Jean a new ability which says that when she attacks, you can choose a card with Shamash from soul, call it to front row rearguard, and it gains plus 15k in a crit. Again, just gotta keep mentioning it here because I don't want you guys thinking that a lot of these units can do 2 damage, because they can't, because they're spirits. Let's take a look at her order though before we discuss the spirit. She has a grade 3 order that costs a soul blast to choose up to 1 shaman from your drop and call it to rearguard. If you were to have 2 or more rearguards with X laws in their card name, you can give your Vanguard plus 5k, and then all of your X law rearguards can boost. So not bad. But next up, let's look at her spirit, Shamash, who has 2 normal units forms. The first lets you return a shaman from drop to board when he's used for oversoul. The second requires you put a card from hand into soul when it boosts Jean, so that you can make your opponent discard a card. If they decline to do so, you get to retire 2 of their rearguards, and then Shamash gains plus 10k. I actually think Shamash is one of the better spirits, with his ability to just keep bringing you rearguards and then being able to force your opponent to either discard or lose units. I think he's pretty good. He got a heal, a crit, and a draw form, so those are the extra targets for the oversoul. But before we move on to the next boss unit, let's talk about the X-Laws, because they are an important part of Jean's deck. There are a total of 4 units with X-Law in their card names, so we'll just go quickly through them. First up is Lyzerg, who actually has his own deck, but in this form, he just gains plus 5k when he attacks if you played an order, and then you can put him into soul to look at the top card of your deck, and you can leave it there or put it on the bottom. Following him, we have Montgomery, who can intercept from the back row if you have a Vanguard with Jean. Following her, we have Chris Ventstar, who can search for Holy Angel Metatron when he's placed on rearguard if you Soul Blast 1 and your Vanguard is Jean. He also then turns the original critical of any Metatrons into 1, so he can do damage. Then let's quickly detour here to check out Metatron, because obviously we have to know what we're talking about, who is a grade 3 spirit that can gain plus 15k when it attacks for a counterblast. Then let's talk about the last X-Slot, Marco, who can search for the Archangel Michael when he's placed on rearguard for a Soul Blast. He also grants any Michael in his column plus 10k in a crit. Again, similarly to Chris's spirit, we have to look at Michael. Archangel Michael is a grade 3 spirit with a quite wordy effect, but it kind of just boils down to when he's placed. If your opponent's Vanguard is grade 3 or greater, you have to rest the Marco, then your opponent can choose to either discard a card or retire a card. If no card is put into drop for this effect, so if they don't discard or retire, you just get to deal your opponent a damage, which is a very insane ability, but it's probably never going to happen. Obviously, your opponent's just going to like discard a card or retire a rearguard. Before we move on, there is one more card in this deck that we need to talk about, and that is Order for Marco. The grade 3 order allows you to grant an Exile unit plus 10k and the ability to restand if its attack hits. So technically the deck can put out 5 attacks, but you have to rely on a rearguard hitting. So you might just get the 4 attacks with Jean. Then we have the final 3, starting with Lyserg Diethel, who we just saw in the Jean deck. I have no idea what that means, like lore-wise, but if you know, please tell me so that I can, I love learning about anything, so I would love to know like the story of this. And I clearly I don't have enough time to watch the anime, but let's get into Lyzerg and his spirit Morphia. Lyzerg only has one form, and his Oversoul requires you put a rearguard Morphea into soul, and then he gains plus 10k, and you search your deck for a Lyzerg order. His second ability activates only if he has used Oversoul that turn. It allows you to look at top two, then you can call one to trigger zone, and then you bottom the other instead of just performing a normal drive check. So you can kind of guarantee yourself some triggers if you keep looking at the top of the deck, as long as there's just no dots. But hey, if there was just 2 dots on top of the deck, at least you get to move them and hope for for a trigger in your second drive check. Before we move on to his spirits, let's look at his orders. There are 2 orders. The first is grade 2 that costs a Counterblast and a Soul Blast, and allows your Lyzerg unit to attack all of your opponent's front row, so you get more attacks per attack. Funny enough, you can actually give this ability to a rearguard Lyzerg to battle the whole front row. I don't know if you would do that, but it is a possibility. The second order, which is a grade 3 that for a CB lets you draw a card, then choose a Lyzerg unit, and it gets when your drive check reveals a trigger, your front row gains plus 5k. Again, this ability can be given to your rearguard Lyzerg, but you're probably just going to give it to Vanguard. So, this order works with his Shrine effect, so that's pretty good. Now let's talk about his spirit, Morphea. She has 2 normal units forms. The first gets plus 2k and lets you look at the top card of the deck when it's placed on rearguard. It also grants protection to any Lyzerg units in the same column as it. The second form works with Oversoul by allowing you to look at the top card and either call it to rear or add it to hand when she's used to pay for the Oversoul ability of Lyzerg. If you do add a card to hand though, you have to discard one, so it's not just free card advantage. As far as her trigger forms, we got a heal, a draw, and a crit. I really wish they had done the heal front crit one a little bit more, but can't complain. But now we move on to the last 2 units in this walk down the Shaman King memory lane. We have the promo, Ana Kiyoyama. I'm not really sure where this promo is from. I believe one of her support units is a box topper, but I'm not sure if she was also in that box as a box topper. I can't remember exactly where this card came from, but it is available. It's on TCG Player. It's not a promo that we haven't gotten. It's like less than $1. But Ana is the one unit in this set without the Overdress or the Oversoul ability. She has no dedicated ride line, so you will have to kind of get a bit creative with this with her ride line there. But she does have support in the set, so it's not like she just is just a promo. But before we look at her support, let's check out Ana herself. When she's placed on Vanguard, you can call a card with Ana in its name from soul to rearguard, which sounds great, but since there's not really a ride line, you are limited to the 3 other Ana cards, and one of them is a perfect guard, so you're probably not going to put it on the ride line, and then the other is a support card for Yo, so you're probably also not going to play it in the ride line. But Ana does have a second skill, which for a Soul Blast lets you swap the position of a Senki and Goki units in the same column when the Senki unit finishes attacking. She then grants the Goki a crit, so it can do damage. Now let's look at the 2 spirits we just mentioned. Senki gains plus 5k and a crit if you have a Ana unit on board and a Goki in the same column. It will retire itself at the end of each turn if you don't have a unit with Ana in its name, so you have to be careful. But I mean, you're playing Ana as your Vanguard, you'll be fine. This ability will never become a detriment. But this ability is pretty much shared across all of her spirit units. Then let's look at Goki, the other unit referenced, who gains plus 10k if you have an Ana unit on board and a Senki in the same column. He's also got the retire skill as well, so just keep that in mind. Then the final spirit we have here is Oni, who has the retire skill similar to the others, so it'll retire itself if you don't have an Ana unit, but again, pretty much irrelevant skill as long as you're playing Ana herself. It lets you put a Ana rearguard into soul to then gain plus 10k in a crit. This is the first time we see a spirit putting a shaman into soul, so it's kind of like he is performing Oversoul, which is actually pretty interesting. His last ability activates in drop, and it lets you bind him to return a shaman unit from drop to deck. There is one Ana that you should definitely play in this deck, and that is Goma Chobuku Ana Kiyoyama, who can, when placed on rearguard for a Counterblast and a Soul Blast, let you call out both Senki and Goki from deck to rearguard. I would even suggest playing it in the ride line so that you can just call it with your boss unit, Ana. Ana also has 2 orders. The first is a grade 2 that for a CB lets you search your deck for any spirit and call it, which is pretty good. So you can search for the Oni if you don't have it, or maybe one of the 2 Zenki or Goki. The second is a Blitz order that for the low cost of just having a Ana Kiyoyama on board, lets you put 2 of your opponent's units to 0 power. So if your opponent's Vanguard swings, you could just put it to 0. I honestly think both of these orders are actually really good by being able to give Ana searching for anything she needs, and a really strong defense by being able to just put 2 units to 0 power until end of turn. So that it's not just for that battle. It makes the unit become 0 power. But let's move on to the final unit, the big bad of the Shaman King show, allegedly. I don't know, but I from what I researched, it does seem like this is the bad guy. That is Hao and his spirit, the Spirit of Fire. Weird that this one didn't get like a name. He's just like the Spirit of Fire, but I'm assuming that's something to do with the show. He has 2 abilities. The first, for a CB, lets you look at top 2 and call the cards you find or discard them. His Oversoul then requires you put a Spirit of Fire into Soul to gain plus 10k. Then you can bind 3 rearguards to choose a card with Spirit of Fire in its card name from Soul or drop, and you call it to the back row center rearguard, and then it can perform attacks from back there until end of turn. Hao does have an insane amount of support units in the set, and going through all of them would take way too long, so we're just going to highlight some of them because this video is already getting really long. But we have Marion and Matisse, who can just put themselves into Soul when they're bound for Hao's effect. Opacho and Lucius can both return themselves to hand when bound. You can retire units with Big Guy Bill and Turbine when they're bound. So there is quite a bit, but we have to move on to Hao's Spirit. The Spirit of Fire has 2 normal unit forms. The first can Soul Charge 1 when your unit is retired if you have a Hao unit. It also gains plus 20k and a crit when it attacks Vanguard if you have a unit with Hao. So we already see some insane power here. Becoming a 33k unit is pretty good. Then we have to look at the second Spirit of Fire. This one can Soul Blast 2 when it's placed on rearguard to gain a crit and force your opponent to have to use 2 cards to guard when he attacks. Not bad, but he can also reduce this cost to 0 as long as you have a unit with Hao in its card name, so it's pretty much free. So you either get a huge power unit or a guard restriction unit. It's pretty good. I honestly, I think this like the Hao deck is actually pretty strong. Spirit of Fire also has a heal, crit, and draw trigger unit form. This is one of the decks that I wish had the heal, crit, front form, but I think only one of them got it, and that's kind of upsetting. But with that, we conclude this walk down memory lane. I actually think some of the decks in the set could compete if they just got a little bit more support. I know Ana is interesting, but with no ride line and barely any support, she is struggling a little bit. I mean, Hao has 4 attacks, and with load of support, you can build them whatever way you want. Jean also seems super fun with all the Exhaws and their effects. I like Zerg and his ability to stack, plus his orders make him actually pretty interesting. I'm honestly thinking of building one of these decks so we can play against Katsu's deck, and we can do one of these, a match between some of these older style decks. I mean, there is the 50 card rule now. We'll have to figure it out. But with that, this has been Leo. I'll see you guys on Cray.